have several heroes in the Saul Price School of Public Policy, and David Sloane is certainly at the top of that list. His coursework spans important issues such as policy, urban planning, community health planning, and public health. His diverse research portfolio spans topics from civil gang injunctions and public safety to health disparities in cardiovascular disease and diabetes among African Americans. David's work focuses on helping underserved communities become healthier. And at the end of the day, when we talk about violent extremism, we're talking about a community engagement. As we gather here today to talk about violent extremism, it comes with the realization that all attempts to model human behavior and identify one's propensity towards radicalization or mobilization of violence have invariably failed. However, the road to violent extremism is cleared by three essential components: an alienated and altruistic individual, a legitimizing ideology, and an enabling community. The only one of those components we can affect is the community. This is where David's focus on community health becomes an important bridge, as we were fortunate to host a panel of formers in an effort to understand the why of radicalization and what we can do about it. You're in for a real treat. And I can tell you that the individuals we're going to bring here today, who I've come to know over the last several years, have been critical in understanding why people may go the way that they go. Professor Sloane's scholarship, teaching, and learning style are comprised of activities where he challenges people and wants to make them feel safe, and he wants them to feel involved. That is exactly what we need to do in response to this complex problem. No one is better suited to facilitate the conversation with this extraordinary panel like my esteemed colleague, Professor David Sloane. Please join me in welcoming him to moderate this session.
Thank you for coming. This is an extraordinary opportunity, I think, to learn about an essential issue in our lives. And we have three panelists. In your book, you have biographies of the panelists, just to remind you. But we're also going to allow them to speak a little bit about themselves as we go through a series of questions. Just as a reminder, for those of you who like technology and have figured out how to use technology, unlike me, there is this thing called Slido, which is around, presumably, on all of your phones or somebody's phone near you, that you can actually send me a question. And that as we go along, I will try and figure out how to do that. But I can tell you there's a really big TV right here that has things on it. So I think I'll be able to read it. And we'll try and get to some of your questions as we move along. I hope you do have had a chance to look at the bios. I've been spending several weeks thinking about these three people. And I can tell you that if you have the opportunity to today and continue, their lives are simply remarkable. Their commitment to what they're doing is amazing. And the struggles that they have gone through are horrifying. And so I think they give us wonderful insight into the issues that we want to talk about. So I'm going to start with a question, first looking backwards in your own lives, but also looking till today. What is missing from youth's lives that would lead them, like you, to radicalize and in some cases commit violent acts? Can we learn from your experiences to begin to understand, if not to generalize, what happens to these youths? Mubin, would you like to start?
Sure. First of all, of course, thank you for inviting us to the conference. I usually begin by just saying Shalom Aleichem, Salamu Alaikum, and the greeting of Jesus Christ, peace be upon you. Because this is something we should keep in mind, I think, to spread peace with each other and to pay it forward and do good. So just to answer the question directly, I think there are a number of things that you can look at as to what's missing in young people's lives. I think sense of meaning and belonging is the big thing. It's a sense of meaning and belonging to something greater than yourself, especially for young kids who are competing in a marketplace, if you will, of popularity or whatever it is. You have many kids who, for whatever reason, they're not comfortable with themselves. They feel the society or their peer groups don't make them feel comfortable. And so they're always trying and chasing after this sense of validation And unfortunately, if they don't find it in their normal peer networks, they'll look for it somewhere else.
Angela?
Thank you for having me here. I would agree with everything that Mubin just said. In addition, thinking about my own experiences, I was raised in a household where I learned racism, stereotypes, homophobia. That definitely had an impact on the way I viewed the world. I struggled with my identity quite a bit as well. I was bullied. As a young girl, I was sexually assaulted. I got to a place where I didn't feel like I was human myself. And that opened the door and made it okay for me to dehumanize others. And I think that's something that we're seeing today as well.
Tony?
I'm a big believer in the idea that the level to which we dehumanize other human beings is a mirror reflection of how internally disconnected and dehumanized we feel. And, I think the source of that feeling less than, toxic shame is what some people call it, where you feel less than, not good enough, unlovable, and we seek out remedies to that. And like Mubin said, if it's not found in a healthy way, it's found in an unhealthy way. And in the skinhead neo-Nazi movement, I found power where I'd felt powerless. I'd found acceptance when I'd felt invisible. And that's sort of what drove my decision making.
I want to talk for a little bit about this shame, because it's a thing which all of you bring up, this individual shame. But let's start with, in some sense, this shame is connected to violence, often in domestic violence or social violence or societal violence. And whether it's a father spanking a child or this idea, which I know several of you talked about, where neo-Nazi demonstrators are looking for violence, for people to bring violence upon them so they can actually bond closer together, which takes us back often to Connie Rice's discussion about street gangs in Los Angeles. This idea, are you able to break them up, or do they actually bond more? How do we move away from reinforcing the shame through violence? How do we change that and release the individuals from it? And how did you release yourselves from that shame that you felt? Tony, you want to start?
Sure. I think, John Bradshaw wrote a great book called Healing the Shame That Binds You. And he was an addictions guy, and he said, shame is the root of all addiction. There was an academic who wrote a book on violence. I can't remember her name. In that book, she said, shame is the root of all violence. And I think shame is the root of a whole spectrum of antisocial disorders, of which violent extremism is one piece. So it's a terrible predictor. We can't predict because someone has shame that they're going to go there. But I think if we address shame in our communities, we heal a whole pile of wounds that plague our society.
And that was true in your life as well, right?
Absolutely. And I believe the antidote to shame is compassion. Compassion cures shame. Name calling and more shame doesn't cure shame. And for me, it was the love of my two children as a single father. The beautiful thing about children is they're safe to love. And it allowed me to open up my heart and go from this place of total disconnection and be connected again, because they're not capable of shaming or ridicule or rejection. So it was a safe place to open up.
Angela?
Shame definitely was a huge factor in what I became involved with. Being taught homophobia, racism, that kind of stuff at home conflicted with who I knew I was inside. I struggled with my sexual identity as an adolescent, and when I realized that I wasn't like everyone else, I wanted to die. I felt like I was going to be excommunicated from my family. I felt disgusting. There was something wrong with me, and that's what I was taught, literally at home. Growing up, one of my mom's most famous sayings was, "You're my daughter. I'll always love you no matter what you do, but never bring home a black person or another woman." And I grew up hearing things like that as a child. for me, violence began to be a factor in my life even before I became involved in the far right. And it was all connected to that shame. And initially, the first time I was physically bullied was the last time. I was humiliated in the 7th grade wearing my training bra. I've struggled with my weight my entire life. And the school bully decided she was going to start a fight and rip my shirt open in front of the entire class. And that was one of the most humiliating experiences. And from that, I decided that I was never going to be on the receiving end of that again. And that began my life of shame intermixed with guilt, intermixed with violence, and carried on from that point.
Mubin?
Yeah, I mean, coming from the religious side of the fence, shame is like a basic religious belief, I think, right? Whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, the whole idea that, all have fallen short of the glory of God, right? We will never be perfect. And certainly in the Muslim culture, there is this, especially among young people, and this is why you see very much in Europe where young men or young women who are involved in criminality, drugs, other activities which are generally shameful in their communities. I mean, their parents or their family members are probably, did you hear what such and such did or so-and-so did? So that kind of pervasive shame. And what it does is it creates what, it's a little term I just made up. I know we're talking about the difficulties with definitions, but rebound radicalization. So you go from this state of you're not very religious, you're doing drugs, moving drugs, doing whatever else, shameful activities, and then they realize that the only way for me to transcend that shame is to become very religious, right? And so they go through this. It's almost like the born again effect, right? Like if smokers, if they were ex-smokers, they become militant anti-smokers. Well, it's very similar to especially young kids who we hear this a lot. These guys weren't religious. They weren't going to the mosque. They're not religiously literate people. But then suddenly, they yell out Aloha snack bar and kill innocent people. I mean, that's as Islamic as saying Bismillah and eating pork, right? You can't do that. So going from this one extreme all the way to another extreme, like overnight or very quickly, I think shame is definitely one of those driving factors. And so I think what is needed, especially for young people, this is where it's really happening, is for young people to have religious scholarship that is understanding of them and understanding of their life, and not, oh my God, you have a boyfriend? Oh my God, you have a girlfriend? Oh my God, you're doing this thing? It makes them feel so bad about what they're doing that the only way that they see that they can fix themselves is by completely shifting to an extreme rebound activity.
I'd like to add to that.
Yeah.
I think it's important to distinguish between healthy shame and toxic shame. Like all healthy emotions are transitory. You feel the flush in your cheek, you feel bad about what you did, it goes away. But toxic shame is about feeling guilty for who you are and feeling shameful about who you are, not what you've done. And it burns like an ember 24/7. And we live our lives in reaction to that. And you could have that exactly rebound radicalization. But I'd ask the audience, what's a word that's the opposite of shame? Pride. White pride worldwide. It's the whole thing is a hyper expression of pride because they're coming from a place of deficit. Right? And that deficit can impact so many areas of our lives.
I would like to add to that too.
Sure.
I think both Mubin and Tony are bang on with that. And I think one of the things that we're really lacking for youth is speaking to them about real world problems. So many are afraid to speak to youth about what they're actually experiencing. They're not given a space, a voice. We're constantly looking down on young people and disenfranchising them. And I think that's a big foot in the door if we're going to start having these kinds of conversations and making actual change and headway with the choices they make in their lives.
So each of you, in your own way, talks about how this shame leads to isolation, either internally or externally within your community. We have a question. how did the community you grew up in influence your ideology on violent extremism? But I'd like to hear you talk not just about the community and the possible isolation from that, but also you've talked about how when people are trying to come out of radicalization, there's another type of isolation, another moment of isolation as they search for a new community. So both, could you address both the isolation that leads to radicalization and isolation that leads out of radicalization? Angela, do you want to start?
Absolutely. I love to talk. Thank you.
And we love to hear you talk.
Definitely, again, going from my own experiences, I was isolated, and I do exactly what you mentioned. I went from one end of the spectrum to the other when I became involved in the violent far right. I ran as far from myself as I could possibly get, and I was isolated initially because I was violent, because I was aggressive. There was no safe harbor for me. And it reminds me of a question that I'm asked almost every time I speak, and that question is, what would have saved you? What would have stopped you on your way into that? And my answer usually is someone like myself, someone like my colleague, someone like Mubin, who has been there, experienced it, and could say, I understand because I've had these experiences. I'm going to adjust this because it's scratching, so bear with me one moment.
So this, of course, goes back to Connie Rice's discussion of gang interventionists and the role of interventionists. As you know, all three of our panelists have been involved in organizations or activities trying to intervene in other people's lives to get them to realize that their move towards radicalization or their place in radicalization is something they want to move out of.
I also would like to just mention that coming out of a violent extremist movement organization, there is a completely different type of isolation. A person builds their entire identity around this group, this belief, this movement. Coming out of it, they're ostracized because of those beliefs, and they need to rebuild an entire identity all over again, and that is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, you've talked about this, Tom.
Yeah, and it is a different isolation, and I was a little bit different as a young kid, and the best way I can describe it is an email we received about a month ago from a mother who said, my son's in this online community of white nationalists, he's 18, he's got Asperger's syndrome. What really frightens me is that my child, for the first time, has found a community that embraces and accepts him, and they embrace and accept him in a way that no one ever has in his life. That child would be willing to believe any ideology in order to get that acceptance. Mm-hmm. And so we get drawn into it. On the way out, when we join an extremist group, we excommunicate ourselves from friends, family, and society, and we're going into a new social network where we're going to get acceptance, attention, approval, because we're not getting it here. We get into that, and when it doesn't pan out, when the disillusionment kicks in, we have to excommunicate ourselves again. But that original friends, family, and society aren't sitting there waiting to welcome us back. We violated the trust in those relationships, and that trust needs to be earned and rebuilt. And so we find ourselves in a place in the middle I call the void, where there is no social circle. There wasn't when I came out. What we've done at Life After Hate is build an online community of formers, and we've got about 50 or 60 people in there now, where there's a community of people in that journey. And some people just pass through and they're there a month. Some people stay there and want to help people who are where they once were. And it's important to have that community to belong to something.
Mubin, in your case, when you were coming out, you were also struggling with the reality that you had helped the Canadian Secret Service, and it was a very volatile political case, the Toronto 18. And so in some sense for you, it was a particularly, I would guess, I'm sure, a difficult transition from this moment of extremism to bringing back to quote unquote normal life.
Yeah, it was interesting because based on my bio, if you read, at 95, I went through my phase of radicalization. met the Taliban in 98. We were all Osama bin Laden. 2001, the 9/11 attacks made me rethink. I'm Indian born, so I didn't know any Arabic, didn't study, ulum al-Sharia or Islamic sciences. Went to Syria when it was still somewhat stable. Spent 2 years there, met the Sufis. For those of you who don't know, the Sufis are like the Jedis of the Muslim world. And it really taught me, it gave me a new perspective. I was wearing glasses at the time. I got laser eye surgery. It's a good decision if you're thinking about it. And he said to me, he goes, I'm going to give you a new pair of glasses by which to see the world. And so just basically he debunked my extremist interpretations using Islamic scriptures, of course. That's why, if I can just use the term here, I don't like the term radical Islamic terrorism. It's a complete false term. The word Islamic is used incorrectly as an adjective here. The correct term is terrorism in Islamic costume. Because it's that whole idea of putting on that costume of now, okay, if I do this, I will now have that validation, sense of meaning and belonging that I'm looking for. I love what you said, Tony, about the void, where you're going through that space, and because your question was originally on isolation, where you have young people who they don't know where their future is, right? They have no real prospects of marriage because they're too young. But there's all these social pressures and cultural pressures for them to get married. And so they do look for this thing that they can just put on. And so I make fun of, ISIS types. I was actually online with ISIS types in real time. When ISIS began, the foreign fighters, so I would debate with them, I would argue with them, I would troll them, I would track them. And even from that platform, we could even pull people out. And what's her face there? Sally Jones, who's since been rendered into pink dust. Yeah, I went there. She was one of the main ISIS mouthpieces. So she put out a death threat against me because of the work that was kind of covered in media of what I was doing online against ISIS, bringing kids out of that group. So just back to what you were saying, after spending 2 years in Syria, I came back to Canada and became an undercover counterterrorism operative. So I was operational for about 2 years, and the last case, which came to be known as the Toronto 18 case, I was operational for 7 months on that case. So when I had gone to Syria, people knew that I was extremist, and they thought, oh, he's gone to Syria, to study, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But I had actually gone there to study. I registered with the embassy. I came back, and a lot of people thought, oh, this guy is like legit. So I was able to operate in the extremist circles very freely because people knew who I was before. But unbeknownst to them, I had completely changed my view. So my story is a little different in that I had now had to go through, again, a new identity construction. Because we were having this conversation the other day, and I'm in the masjid, in salah, in prayer, and I'm thinking to myself, Ya Allah, like, what am I doing here? I'm spying on these guys next to me. I'm praying in the mosque with them. They're my brothers for all intents and purposes. But am I betraying them? Am I a traitor? Am I, a munafiq? Am I a hypocrite? These were the kinds of things. But, a voice kept telling me that, look, what these guys are up to is far worse than what you're doing. You're trying to save people. These people are trying to kill people, right? So I got over it very quickly. But just to close this point about, humans are social creatures, right? I mean, we are part of human networks, of social networks. We need friends, we have significant others, all that stuff. And wherever there is a dysfunction or a malfunction in that regard, you can see the results of it. You can see that the result is malfunction. It could be a maladaptive personality or something along those lines. So it's very fragile, the societies in which we live, human beings, we need constant care. We're so high maintenance. And in young people even more so. I mean, as adults, at least we've been doing this a long time. My brother and sister here, we've been doing this for a long time. In 2011 was the summit, right, in Dublin, Ireland. They brought 4 categories together, if I can just, ultra-nationalists, white supremacists, religiously motivated, and urban street gangs. And compared and contrasted, and actually the umbrella term for violent extremism included these 4 groups. And what they did is they took members from each group, put them on a panel, and basically said, hey, you know, what got you into the group? What were the mechanisms that kept you in the group? And what were those things that got you out of that group? And surprise, surprise, the experience across the spectrum is very, very similar. So I think, and I just kind of close with this, it's very important to have the right explanation, the right understanding. Like when I said terrorism in Islamic costume, here Islamic is used correctly, right? And it's important because especially now when, you know, we're talking about definitions, right? I mean, I've been hanging around with academics too long, right? And I think they're, you know, they spend their life doing this stuff, right? Studying things, and so they have to go into the nitty-gritty. But I think it's quite easy to define certain basic concepts. I'm not going to do it now, but I'm just saying there is a basic understanding we can all agree on, and then go from there, right? Don't get hung up on words and semantics and this. There's a shared experience that we all have. You don't necessarily have to be an extremist or, you know, an undercover or whatever. You can see with your own eyes what's going on, right? You're smart people. You can see what's happening. So just in that, I think it's important for us to kind of, for all of us to, I mean, listen to what we have to say. I mean, we have a crazy, crazy life experiences, but I think you guys have a lot to offer as well. So just want to throw that out there.
So I was going to do this later, but now that you brought it up,
sorry.
Let's talk a little bit about definitions, since that seems to be a topic of the day.
All right.
As many of you might have read, Max Abrahams had an op-ed in Sunday's New York Times, and we've also talked about it earlier here, about the different ways the media discusses the South Carolina shooting versus the Texas shooting, or you can use example after example. One is terrorism. One is a case of a deeply troubled human being. And Abrahams questions whether we really know what terrorism means, whether we are using that term in specific ways, or I guess there's someone who came up with 50 different definitions for terrorism. And so how do you define terrorism, and how is it relevant to what you do? Tony?
That's a good question, and I think you know, I think the way that we look at it, you know, if we have compassion for everybody else but not ourselves, that's about ego. We have compassion for ourselves and nobody else, that's narcissism. And I think the way that we look at it when the same events happen and we point to other people to blame who are from the other community, and when we try to look at when it happens within the white community, like in those instances that we try to find understanding and human causes for it. And it's very telling of our society's reaction to that. And it's a very narcissistic way of looking at things that colors how we define terrorism.
Angela?
I'm not going to be quite as nice as Tony. I'm going to just be very frank. It's very clear to see that when it's a brown person, it's terrorism or domestic extremism. When it is a white person, it's a mental health issue. I do my best to take positives out of the worst situations. Given our current political climate, I think this is the perfect time for us to come together as a community to support one another and to come up with fair definitions. You know, working these past 6 years in CVE, I could go to 10 different events and hear 10 different types of terminology. It's domestic terrorism, domestic extremism, it's homegrown extremism, regular terrorism. And if we can't count on our government to come up with fair definitions, I think that responsibility lands on us. And I put that out there as a call to action for everyone, for us to work together and to fairly describe what this is. Essentially, I mentioned this in the email, you guys feel free to chime in here. As a visual, there's that children's toy where we teach, you know, young children critical thinking, we teach them shapes, colors. I think of violent extremism as this toy. And what we've been doing is forcing squares, or trying to force squares into triangles, trying to force the triangle pieces into the, the holes for the circles. And we need to stop doing that. There's similarities, yes, but there are also distinctions that need to be made there.
Mubin.
All right, I got it for you. It's easy. All right, so we hear a lot of terms, and I'm going to shoot out some quick. So radicalization. Radicalization is a normal, human, psychosocial process whereby people become increasingly extreme in their views. Okay, it's a process. The end result of radicalization is extremism. It's where you come to believe that violence in the public space or in private property is legitimate, is allowed, is acceptable. Okay, if you act on that, you're a violent extremist. So radicalization gets divided into two, right? This blame the academics, all right? So there's radicalization, which is normal and natural and okay. Then there's what's called violent radicalization, where the process ends in violence. So violent extremism is really the same as terrorism. Terrorism is a highly politicized word, right? Basically, we can say it's violence in pursuit of political or ideological goals. The problem is that there is a popular or a public discourse use and definition of the word, and then there is the legal technical use of the word. And Tom, I'm totally not going to ruin your presentation, but there is a thing, and I do want to kind of reinforce it a little bit, is that should every act of violence be terrorism? I don't think so. When people ask, why is Las Vegas, why is that not terrorism? No political motive. Why is any Muslim guy acting out in the name of ISIS, why is that automatically terrorism? Well, because in the US context, terrorism is always linked to a foreign group. But, Joe White supremacist, he's not linked to a foreign terrorist group. So what he's doing is not terrorism, right? But that's unfair, isn't it? So what we're dealing with, I'm going to nerd out for a second, is in social psychology, is in-group, out-group dynamics. So when a member of my group does something, it's not as bad. But when their group does it, oh my God, it's the worst thing that ever happened, right? So, now is not the time to talk about gun control, this and that. But brown guy does it, oh man, we got to do this, and this. So it is a social, psychological bias that we have, and we have to train people to, just like Tony said, or even Angela was saying, we don't look at when a member of our group does it as, oh, it's not so bad. And then when they do it, it's so much worse. So I think these biases, these psychological biases, societal biases, limits of what, legal definitions vis-a-vis terrorism, these are all things that need to be viewed in that context.
So one of our questions goes, oh, there it is. Sorry if there's moving questions on my screen. One of the questions that the audience has asked is how do social networks perpetuate radicalization, and how can they be used, or how do you use them, as you suggested, to distance, it moved again, to counter or prevent it, radicalization. Did that make sense? They moved my question a couple of times.
Well, I think one of the challenges is with social media is they become echo chambers, right? They feed us what it thinks we're interested in. Even, Amazon.com, you can go to that and order a book on the Klan, and then it goes, well, if you like that, you might be interested in this, and it gives you, next thing you know, this is the Turner Diaries. And so, we need to look at, how to do a pattern interrupt into those echo chamber behaviors. And I think there is a role definitely for social media and those companies to try and not be part of the problem.
Does Life After Hate use social media regularly? Is there part of their attempt to work in and work with individuals?
Absolutely. We've done some great projects in the past with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. I think, there she is, Sasha. Where we used social media both to target interventions, find someone who's radicalizing, that is displaying extremist behavior online, and also by people searching for extremist content, we put videos that steered them away from it in in their path, in their feed, you know, when they went to search for a white power video on YouTube. So it's definitely can be used for part of the solution.
Angela?
Oh, can of worms. So this may be a little controversial. We've seen lately domains and internet hosts pulling websites from, you know, violent far-right groups, organizations. So we see them harness those spaces for all kinds of reasons: recruitment, communication, indoctrination. We can use social media in reverse. You know, if they use it to recruit, we can use it to send out counter narratives, different messaging. But at the same time, that whole free speech thing comes to mind, and we have to be very careful of how words become violence. But at the very same time, when we take away their platforms, we take away our own ability to monitor what they're saying, what they're planning, what they're doing. And that can pose a problem for everyone, for academics, for law enforcement, for public safety. And these are some of the things that I think we really need to dig into and harness it in the same way that they do, because they're definitely using it across the board. I can't think of any extremist belief based on religion, you know, ideology that is not harnessing the internet right now and using that power for the dark side.
Mubin?
I'm loving the Star Wars references. Sufis, Jedis, remember. Social media is a force multiplier. That's the term that's used. There's no such thing as self-radicalization. No such thing. Nobody goes on the internet, sees something, realizes, yeah, and then goes with it. They've already decided to engage in that narrative. And social media is just a platform where the echo chambers exist. So if I'm already inclined to believing something because of whatever reason, you know, personal trauma or something, and I go online and then it starts to feed into, you know, it's like confirmation bias, right? It's one big exercise in, I already believe this thing. I'm going to go out and seek those things that validates what I already believe. I want to echo the point that Angela made as well, because, okay, let me just kind of say, the social media platforms, there's nobody from Facebook and Twitter here, right? Look, they are responsible. They are responsible, partly responsible. Twitter, I hope no one from Twitter is here, please forgive me, enabled ISIS, straight up, enabled ISIS. I saw them do it. I saw it happening in real time in front of my face. Watershed moment, YouTube starts blocking Anwar al-Awlaqi's videos. Yeah, in 2017, you're blocking them? It's a watershed moment? It's not a watershed moment. What I've been so frustrated at, and I know I hide it very well, is, I mean, I was on social media, on Twitter and Facebook, 2012, 13, well, 2011, but 2012, 13, 14, and 15, almost every day with ISIS, foreign fighters, wannabes. I spend way too much time with these people. Social media companies, they didn't do jack squat about stopping these people. Then we had conversations on, you know, well, will the blocking of accounts actually do anything? I don't know, blah, blah, blah. But guess what happened? When they started blocking accounts, this and that, yeah, the adversary they would always insult us back. They would say, you know, die in your rage, oh infidels, right? Die in your rage, account number 479, okay? Because every time you took one down, one went up right away. So I was in this space where I was so frustrated with seeing all these things happening and just wondering to myself, how are these people allowed to proliferate their accounts like this? They're openly recruiting people. I'm watching them do it, and nothing was being done about it. And then I hear the flip side of it. And the flip side of it is that, well, if we do shut everything down and close them all off, we don't know who they are. We don't know what they're saying. We don't know what the recruiting narratives are. And we're not going to be able to counter it, right? And one, you know, XYZ agency person said, Shaikh, if tomorrow we shut down all the accounts, does that change the fact that they still control land in Iraq and Syria? No, it doesn't, right? Of course, now they've been beaten back. Caliphate is the term you should use, caliphate. There's a technical Islamic term called khawarij. The khawarij are those who exited the religion because of their behaviors. So, these were the kinds of terms and labels that I used on them, and I kept reinforcing on them. But the point is, at the end of all of this, social media is a necessary evil, if you will. There's an Islamic scholar, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who he said a very nice thing. It's like a sword, a two-sided sword with no handle. So it can be wild in that sense. And so I think our role in all of this is everyone's using it. I think that we don't need to get, super smarty pants on the counter messaging, quote unquote. You have high school students who are 10 times more technically capable than probably 90% of the people in this room. College students, university students, if they're teachers here, you can give them projects for marks that they can then deploy on the internet just for, homework purposes and still achieve a counter-messaging aspect. We went through this whole thing in the beginning where the U.S. government was trying to do it. U.S. State Department had a thing at the beginning, the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. I personally think it was a very good project. They didn't get the funding that they should have been getting. The one English account they had, of course, media, just trash-talked anything and everything they tried to do. You know what I mean? And I know the people that were doing it, they were doing really good work. If ISIS is able to put out these so-called sophisticated videos, you're telling me that with what you have just in LA, in terms of movie-making capabilities, that you can put out a competitive product to ISIS in all this time? That's unacceptable. Sorry.
No. It's just a lot. I'm sure it's a lot for you as well in thinking about all the things that we can talk about. And there are some good questions here, but I do have one thing I really want us to discuss, and that is, Angela, often people, when they think about violent extremism, think about men. And in some sense, I think we need to know better about this movement, and to bring gender into the question, I think, is an essential part of that conversation. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
I just happen to agree with you on that. So I'm just going to use my own experience as the impetus for what I'm about to say. Women face absolutely gendered differences in the way we're treated, recruited, the expectations, specifically in the far right. It was very confusing. Women in the far right are expected to be baby makers, barefoot pregnant in the kitchen. At the same time, women are expected to embody masculine traits, a willingness to be violent, strength, knowledge, about around the indoctrination. But the strange part is there are these competing ideals of what women are supposed to be, what they're supposed to do, what they're supposed to look like, how supportive they're supposed to be. Dr. Kathy Blee wrote about this. At the same time, in the far right, that women are placed on pedestals, they are abused and mistreated by the men they're supposed to be supporting. And at the same time that is happening, they're activists that are using their activism to dehumanize other people. And this is something that, I'm sorry, guys, it goes unnoticed, it goes untalked about. Women's issues are still in those dark spaces and swept under the rug, and they definitely need to come out of those dark spaces, specifically because women are targeted for recruitment. If you recruit a woman, the thinking is you get her spouse, you get her children, you get her other, close relatives, you get her friends. And coming out of it, women face even more problems because they're not only dealing with the isolation, they also now have to go back and deal with the abuse they faced while they were there. And these are things that they parallel a lot of what we see happening current event-wise, especially around sexual harassment and mistreatment. It's even worse involved in the violent far right. I can't speak on other violent extremist movements, but from women I've worked with, I've heard a lot of it echoed back at me.
Do either of you want to add to that? I have a second question.
Absolutely. I think what Angela says is bang on, and I've had the privilege to read a preview copy of Michael Kimmel's book coming out, who wrote Angry White Men, and talks about what is the elephant in the room, and that's this unhealthy, distorted sense of masculinity, and that it's these men feeling not good as men, adopting a sense of masculinity that's not accurate, it's not real, it's not healthy. And the victims of that are the people that they beat up and the women that they abuse.
Yeah, just quickly on the religious extremist side. In my presentations, I usually use, because I take these screenshots that I grabbed off of Twitter with my interactions with a lot of these ISIS people, and it was a mine, you know, a gold mine of information on how they recruited and whatnot. There's this one picture that I always use to introduce my women in ISIS section, and basically the quote goes, "Caring wife of a mujahid today and loving mother of the mujahid tomorrow." And it's the same thing, the idea of religious handmaidens, right? Your job is to procreate primarily and to support the man, because the man is the one who's at the front and he's at the forefront. And of course, we all know Professor Kimmel and his book on, especially on hypermasculinity. And you see this especially in the ISIS videos, how they appealed to young men. There were a number of videos that they had put out. There was one, they were very clever. You know, they used the white guy from Canada, from, you know, Timmins, Ontario, and presented him in such a way that, you know, he was not the crazy, right? But the thing is, if you look at all the other videos, what they're telling that 15, 16-year-old kid is, you know what? You can be the Muslim Rambo, right? And these girls who are actually at home, you know, the parents think that, oh, my daughter is so pious, she's listening to the Quran in her room. No, she's talking to her jihadi boyfriend online, right? Because he's got long hair and big guns, right? And he's looking like the Muslim Rambo. And, you know, there's a very important point about when, in society in general, whenever rights are given to people, you know, that should be there, of course, from the beginning, but we're human beings, it takes us a while. When women were given the right to vote in the West, it was, oh my God, the men thought, oh my God, women are going to take over, right?
You mean when women fought for the right to vote?
Well, I mean, and even after that,
yes.
I mean, you still have pay disparity. You still have these issues, right? Like, and you do have to fight. You have to keep fighting for it. But the point is that how the men feel now, we're losing something, right? Because we've dominated everything all the time anyway, and now we have to share, and we don't like to share, do we? So. Hypermasculinity, as you describe it in the far right group, is not so different from the religious extremist groups.
I would like to add just briefly to that. I think that we need to look more broadly too, because certainly in society, there are unrealistic expectations of men. You know, men, you're not allowed to have emotions. You're not allowed to be sensitive because you're looked at as weak. And those are broader problems that I think if we address those on a larger level, it wouldn't be as prevalent in these movements.
I think what we need to define what is masculine in a healthy way, and I think you know, with masculinity, we don't have a healthy sense of who we are as men. It needs to be validated by other men, and when we surround ourselves in a circle of other men who have a distorted and unhealthy view of masculinity, that's what we live up to.
Yeah.
So we've talked several times about how it's a process, both becoming radical and leaving radical. But one of our one of our audience asked, was there a tipping point for your extreme outlooks, and how can we apply those experiences learned to help others who are gripped by extremist views? So tipping point going in, tipping point coming out.
The tipping point coming out for me was the birth of my daughter, you know, and being handed this beautiful little baby girl with this scrunchy face, and she hadn't opened her eyes, and her eyes opened, and I connected to a human being for the first time since I couldn't remember when. My face was the first picture her brain was going to take, and I had a son 15 months later, and that was the compassion that they had. You know, there was 3 sources of compassion in my life: my 2 children, my mother who hated what I did but never gave up on me, and a Jewish mentor that I met in 2005. And I think the thing to remember about compassion is, you know, when we're compassionate with another human being, we hold up a mirror and we allow that person to see their humanity reflected back at them when they can't see it on their own otherwise. And I think it's important to remember that. I always challenge people to go out in the world and be compassionate to someone who you don't feel deserves it. Because the hardest thing to do in the world is to have compassion for someone who has no compassion. But they're the ones that need it most, and hold up that mirror to them and pay attention to 2 things: how it makes them feel, and more importantly, how it makes you feel. It's quite a transformative process.
Angela?
There were several things for me. I went to prison in 1998 for my part in a hate crime. And I went in there, a very violent young woman covered in racist tattoos. My case was highly publicized. I went into solitary confinement because obviously they didn't know if, you know, I was going to go in there and try to start a race war, or if people were going to try to kill me. Going in there, I expected that whatever time I was there, I would be spending it with my back against the wall, fighting and defending myself. I was in no way prepared for what actually happened. You're going to have to excuse me for the potty mouth, but I smoked cigarettes at that time, and there was a rec area. I went out there and I was smoking by myself, and this woman of color looked at me, and I couldn't tell, you know, is she staring at me because she knows who and what I am? And she said, "Hey, do you know how to play cribbage?" And I turned around and said, "What in the fuck is cribbage?" I had no idea what it was. And that woman picked up that cribbage board and came over and sat down next to me and taught me how to play cribbage. She was nothing like what I had been taught my entire life. I'd been taught to fear people that weren't like me, that didn't look like me, that didn't come from the places I came from. And for her to know I was there for a hate crime, for her to know who I was, and to still show that kindness and offer that hand of friendship changed the entire course of my life. I would not be sitting here today if it were not for those types of experiences. They changed who I was as a human being completely and totally.
Tipping points. I mean, if you look at radicalization as that process, psychosocial process, there are many things that are active in a person's life that take them down that road or keep them on that journey. So there's never one thing usually. I mean, there's sometimes a traumatic moment which might create what radicalization nerds call cognitive openings. You know, I mean, if there's a death in the family, people become very religious suddenly, right? So these kind of trauma moments, how they make you open up to things you were normally not open to. Well, in the getting out process, it's the same way, right? There's a number of things that add up and then build up together, and then there is, you can say, a tipping point. But remember, that tipping point assumes that there's already some weight on the scale. So for me, it was a number of things. Like I mentioned, 95 was my time. I met the Taliban and hung out with them for a little bit. But it was 1998 when I got married. I got married to a girl that I knew from high school. She's Polish. I always make the joke, she's glow-in-the-dark white. She's the immigrant. She came on a boat, right? Immigrant stealing all the best genre. And in 1999, I had my first child. It was my son. And I named him Mujahid, right? Like one who does jihad. So I was still in that mindset. But it was calming me down. And after I got married, I actually did we had this great honeymoon tour. We went to Mecca and Medina, for the last 10 days of Ramadan, which is the holiest month of the year. Those last 10 days are the holiest days. I did Eid in Mecca. I went to Egypt, did the tourist thing in Egypt. I was with my wife riding on horseback around the pyramids. It was so cool. And then I went into Jerusalem through the Rafah border in Egypt. Got to Jerusalem, and this was 1998, before 9/11, and I didn't really mention this, but the way I used to dress before was like I had the look, right? I had the big beard, black turban, and long robes, and I dressed like that for almost 15 years. And so, getting into Israel, looking like that, I have an Arab name, like my name is Mubin Shaikh, but I'm Indian background, right? Bollywood Indian. So it wasn't a problem for me to get in, right? And so I saw with my Canadian passport, I got to the hotel, the wall, and actually those were moments that I was able to sit and just think, wow, you know what? Like, I can't believe I'm here. I mean, it's because I'm Canadian, and so there were a number of things that got me, and I always found a time to reflect on those things. And then 9/11, of course, was that massive traumatic moment for everybody. Just watching it, and so that really took me out. Just one last thing. I think what we need to do is be aware of these points in people's lives that drive them into that process of radicalization. And if you can be aware of those things and be aware of those things that get people out, then you can do your part. You don't need to be a counselor, expert, operative, whatever. Just need to know the things that are happening in people's lives, and then intervene in their life with compassion. You'll do a lot more good than even, can I say, government-funded programs, right? Or like research papers, right? Or conferences. This is a good conference, by the way. But I'm just saying that we can all be aware of these things and do our part.
I don't know. You're picking on those scholars.
I'm doing it deliberately, man. Deliberately.
Let's not forget I'm one of those people.
I know. The academics radicalize me.
I just want to add a little bit to that. When I look at my whole journey in and out, what I consider to be my radicalization is those points in my life where I became disconnected from my heart. And when I talk about de-radicalization, it was those things in my life that reconnected me. And I think it had nothing to do with ideology, but it's the process of disconnection and reconnection.
So we're coming to the end of our panel, and I really would like us to leave the audience with one or two takeaways, particularly perhaps for the members of law enforcement who are in the audience today. And I was wondering if you could start with something, Mubin. Again, you've talked about this on a number of different occasions, that there actually is a distinction between someone who has begun to take on extreme religious views and someone who's going to be violent. And law enforcement, I think, or let's say the public discourse, let's not blame it on law enforcement, sort of mashes those together. They conflate the two. And what can be our expectations of people in a religious extremist? Is it that they're going to become moderate religious people, or is there some way that we can help them realize that they can be devout without becoming violent?
So I became more sympathetic to law enforcement and the state, deep state, when I became a part of them, right? And when I kind of went through the operational stuff, because there is the fluffy, nicey public stuff, okay? And then there's the on-the-ground, covert, you're seeing people do things where normally they hide from other people, right? So you see a reality and a truth in that context. So the question was always, what is the mandate of law enforcement, right? Beyond just enforcing the law. There's an expectation on police. You got to be, you got to be able to shoot straight, number one. You got to be able to be a counselor, and you got to be this, and you got to be a good father and a good husband. And it's like, even the police identity is kind of like all over the place. Who am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to do? So when they deal with these kind of offenses or these kinds of cases, what do, right? Their job is not to de-radicalize people. They're not qualified to do that, number one. It's not their mandate. They haven't had any training in it. So don't even think that that's something you need to do. So there's two things. There's disengagement, which is convincing people not to be violent, action-wise. Then there's de-radicalization, which is the cognitive shift. So one is a behavioral shift, and one is a cognitive shift, where you no longer believe in your extremist views. And people say this, like whether you call it being moderate or what I would just call being a normal Muslim. Law enforcement knows that they can't arrest their way out of the problem. But what they do need, and this is something I want to put back to the communities, because there's some things that even the communities are saying which is just not right. Okay, I mean, I'm going to say it openly because I've heard it too often and I'm just bothered by it. Asking or Muslims speaking out against extremism and terrorism done by terrorists in Islamic costume is not Islamophobic, okay? It's the worst use of the term Islamophobia, okay? That's not where you use it. It is our responsibility as Muslims to resist those people, those posers and fakers called ISIS or whoever they want to call themselves, that these people are not Islam, all right? So that's one thing. Communities, however, feel under siege, right? Especially after 9/11, especially now in the current environment. So they're reluctant to engage with law enforcement in that sense. So what I would encourage is, the takeaway is that law enforcement and community organizations need to put aside the terrorism thing for a second and just think on community safety. Your kids, they're going to get arrested by the LAPD patrol officer, right? It's not the FBI. If the FBI gets involved, it's a whole other can of worms. But I think communities and law enforcement need to understand that, for example, especially now where hate crimes are increasing, especially against religious communities, Jews and Muslims. I think the FBI just came out with a recent hate crime report. Communities need to understand that when their mosques get attacked, when the shul or the synagogue gets attacked, it's going to be the patrol officer that's going to respond. And I think there needs to be a just putting aside all the politics and everything else, just a pure community safety approach that needs to be taken. As long as each one understands what their limits are and what they can do. I think there's also an unfair expectation on Muslim communities as well. People don't come into mosques to pray with a sign, I'm going to join ISIS next week, on their head. It's like when you go to a church, you don't know which pastor is the pedophile. You don't know when you go to any whatever place of worship who the person is next to you. You might be one of those lazy late people and you came in, at the end of and you come to the end and you don't know who you're sitting next to. So public needs to understand that communities can only do so much by themselves. Law enforcement has huge responsibilities on them. They're expected to prevent every single attack, every single time, and nobody's supposed to help them with information and intelligence and whatever else. That's not fair either. So certainly there's a middle ground which both can come to, and I hope after this is done, beyond just the talking, you can actually make some real connections. Thanks.
Angela?
I'm going to shamelessly plug Life After Hate.
Yeah.
So,
Life After Hate?
Yes.
.com?
Yes, exactly.
.org.
.org and our Exit USA program.
What was that again?
Our Exit USA program. So Life After Hate is the only organization operating in the U.S. that was founded completely by former violent extremists and is run by former violent extremists today, mostly working on the far right, but in global networks with individuals we can reach out to when we need help. So a really good solution for me is exactly what Mubin said. Let's put the politics aside. Let's offer law enforcement a credible place to refer people. Specifically coming out of the far right, there's some paranoia, some conspiracy theorists. They may not view law enforcement as credible, as you understand me. There's that idea, you're just here to bust me for something. So if we offer resources and give law enforcement a place to point those people to that is outside of that sphere, we may have better luck in shutting down some of these things. I think that's why we're successful, why we're able to do what we do, because we can say, we've been there, we understand it. You know, I had this same experience, I can help you. We're not in the information sharing business. So, you know, people don't have to worry about us running off and saying, oh, this person contacted us. Obviously, we have mandatory reporting policies, but we are a resource, and we can be used as that resource when law enforcement cannot offer that.
I'm going to jump over the Life After Hate shameless promotion myself.
The bandwagon?
.org. And pick up where Angela left off, because you may not know who we are necessarily and what we do. And this year has been a huge year for Life After Hate, and that we had a grant that was awarded under Obama administration that was rescinded in June by the Trump administration. And this year has been, the theme has been, we're going pro. And so as we started to receive more donations, we've upgraded the accounting system. When Colin Kaepernick gave us $50,000, I was the executive director. I fired myself and hired Sammy Rangel, who's over there, who's got 18 years counseling experience as Masters of Social Work, and run programs with very at-risk populations. An amazing guy. And we, through him, we decided to adopt the Social Work Code of Ethics. And I think, you know, part of us going pro is there was things we were doing that we probably weren't the best and we shouldn't be doing them. There's things that we weren't doing and needed to start doing them. And so he's helped guide us through this process of professionalizing the organization and building capacity and metrics, and so that we're doing things that are evidence-based. And we've partnered with research groups. We've got a 3-year research project coming to the end this year that Angela's worked a lot on, where we had Pete Simi and Kathy Blee and the Research Triangle Institute in North Carolina. We interviewed 48 formers and did whole life inventory interviews, 6 to 8 hours long, and 16 of those were women. We have the largest percentage of female extremists in that sample, and so we've got a ton of information it's just percolating out of the research now that we can use to guide us in our efforts going forward. And I think there's sometimes a gap between where academics drill down to and the reality on the ground. And so I think we can play an important role in bridging that gap so that we're both informed by academia, but we're also informing the research as well to come to a solution that works. The mission statement of Life After Hate is to inspire people to a place of compassion and forgiveness for themselves and for all people. And, you know, with regards to law enforcement, I think, you know, one of the most difficult things about compassion is it has to be accompanied by healthy boundaries and consequences, right? If we are compassionate with someone and they have no boundaries, it's a recipe to get walked over. And the police are entrusted by society for the enforcement of boundaries and consequences on behalf of society, and that's a critical role. And I think if we have compassion and no boundaries and consequences, it's a disaster. And I think if we have boundaries and consequences without compassion, it's a disaster. And I think you know, we need to develop those two hand in hand. We need to be compassionate, yet hold people accountable for what they do. And when those two are married together, it's an extremely powerful tool.
So it turns out we have a little bit more time than that clock suggests.
Oh.
And so let me go to one of the questions. With youth at risk for extremist recruitment, what roles, what are two things would you suggest that family, friends, and teachers can play in preventing the continued radicalization? Mubin?
Do your part. If you're a teacher, don't be a spy. If you're you know, an imam or whatever, you don't need to necessarily call the FBI all the time. Do your part, right? I don't like the idea of course, teachers should be able to refer up the chain when they need to. You know, if there is a number you need to call, then call that number, right? Sometimes there's a disparity in the communities, what's supposed to be done, who you're supposed to go to. So number one is for family, friends, do your part. You know, be compassionate, don't be judgmental. I know it's hard. I know you want to like berate your child into obedience. Not gonna work, right? Has never worked. And number two, know your limits, right? So I really like what Angela said about know who to refer people to. Just kind of piggybacking lastly on the law enforcement and community organization aspects of it. I think what you need to do is community organizations, Muslim community organizations that already have a track record of working with their communities, doing it voluntarily first and foremost for a number of years. I would say, keep a list, have a roster of like almost like a mediation roster, right? Like in corporate a mediation and arbitration, you usually have a list of people that you can go to for your issues. So I think community organizations, families, teachers, whatnot, need to have a referral agency that they can at least rely on. And one thing that's really cool is don't put past the value that a former white supremacist has talking to a so-called jihadi. You'd be surprised how good these people are in dealing with that. So those are my two.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa, yeah.
I would add to that and take kind of a little bit of a different direction. I don't know if he's here yet. Dr. Pete Simi, are you here yet? Maybe not. A few years ago, he worked on a paper that was about non-ideological precursors to violent extremism. And this certainly isn't the case across the board, but there is a little bit of a theme that people do not just go out and join these groups because they hate. People don't go out and join a neo-Nazi group just because they woke up one day and said, I hate everybody. There's a void there. There's something missing. And if we can learn to identify these gaps, we can educate families, we can educate teachers, we can educate law enforcement about how to identify them and what to do for those gaps. So for instance, again, I'll use my own experience. When I was bullied, there was nobody there to talk to. There was nobody there to mediate. There was nobody there. And I was at such a fragile time. I was such a fragile person then. I internalized everything. So my own humanity was stripped, and that made it okay for me to strip others of their humanity. So if there would have been a way, some kind of process, some kind of identification to help work on those specific issues, things would have probably turned out a whole lot different. So if we are able to perhaps, work on broad campaigns to alert families, loved ones, teachers who are coming into contact with young people all the time about what to look for and how to address it. Is it, someone who's being abused and they're looking for protection? Is it someone who is bullied? Is it someone struggling with their identity? These are the kind of things that we see in retrospect, dealing with other formers, sharing our own stories and narratives. We all come back to these same voids. And that's not 100% across the board. There are a few people that come from healthy, loving homes that still end up radicalized. But I would go out on a limb and say those cases are few and far between.
I think, especially if we're dealing with a young person, a child, I think it's, we want to attack the ideology. We want to get in there and give them facts and figures how they're wrong about immigration. And I think the challenge that we need to understand is that ideology and identity become intertwined. And when we intuitively go after the ideology to try and change the child, we attack their identity, and the back goes up. And it was Sammy, taught me this, that you can listen and validate someone's feelings without accepting or believing in their story, right? And I think it's important that, because these people are not feeling listened to and heard to, that they go down, that's part of what's attractive to this movement. And I think we need to be able to listen to them and not attack their identity.
So, go ahead.
I want to just clarify something. We, and when I say we, I mean former violent extremists, have the ability to go out and deal with current extremists or individuals who are being radicalized in a way that others can't be expected to. I certainly would never ask a person of color to go hug a Nazi or to take that step. And I think that we have to be careful because we do have to have compassion. One of our co-founders and colleagues, Frank Mink, has this funny saying that he had never been to a rally or a march and been ducking, someone throwing a bottle at him that made him stop and think, hey, they're throwing bottles at me. I want to change and become a different person. So on one hand, we have to be cautious when we advise people to go out and use compassion and use kindness. It changes lives, but be careful how you do it. I can go into dangerous situations. I can go speak to current extremists if I wanted to and say, I'm not going to judge you because if I do, I'm judging the person I used to be. But I wouldn't say that across the board, everyone should go hugging neo-Nazis.
That's probably good advice.
Yeah.
We'll do the hugging for you.
And I say that partially because I had the wonderful experience of working with a social psychologist, Karen Hennigan, here at USC, and a criminologist who is now at the University of California, Irvine, on street gangs and efforts by police to use a specific tactic, civil gang injunctions, to try and limit their impact upon their community. And one of the things that we found in our research, I believe in research, and so do you, thank you.
Sure, yes, of course.
Is that in some sense, how you implement policies, how you implement change matters a lot. So if you do it very targeted, you do it very effective, you combine it with other kinds of resources, helpful resources, social services resources, it works a lot better than if you just try and bring in a bunch of police officers.
Yes.
And so one of the questions here is, how is law enforcement doing right and wrong? What are they doing right and wrong? And you in some sense answered it, but I guess I would like you to be more specific. Is there a piece of advice that you would give to law enforcement about, this really made our group get more cohesive, not break off members? Or is there a tactic, a strategy, an activity that actually began to make people feel more human?
Are you looking at me?
What was that?
I'm not looking at anybody.
Go ahead, Mubin.
All right, I'll jump on that. I'm very sympathetic to law enforcement. I've seen what they've had to do, and damned if you do and damned if you don't, right? That's what a lot of them have told me, is that people don't care. They, they demand us to be at their service like servants and slaves, and they give us no respect. They give us no support. Okay, so I'm just explaining the mentality of what some have explained to me. I'm Canadian, so I have to watch I don't want to call it the tragedy that is American policing, sorry. No, I have to look at it from a very different context. Obviously, our operating context is very different. When you look at policing in the UK, the context is very different. So you have a culture, a national culture, that it locks you into certain behaviors, unfortunately. So I can talk about hyper-militarization of police is a terrible, terrible thing. It's a terrible thing. There's a reason why soldiers don't police areas, right? It usually doesn't turn out well. So I think what police need to do, if I can say that, in terms of what they're doing right, I don't want to say think back to the good old days, okay? But if you do go back to when earlier policing, okay, where the police walked the beat, quote unquote, right? And there was this nostalgia of those days where that officer or those officers that were walking, they knew everyone in the community. They didn't need warrants to get, to collect intelligence, because people were coming off of their verandas and their porches saying, hey, Officer so-and-so, that place over there, ... In Canada, we had there was this crazy experiment where, it was a troubled area, and they had a community barbecue. And their job was just to hand out hot dogs and Coca-Cola and Sprite and whatever else. And the officer told me, he said, we got so much intelligence just handing out hot dogs, unsolicited, because the community saw that, hey, these people are out here. They're talking to our kids. They actually look like they care. What's happened now in this hyper-modern age, hyper-technology, making jokes about us being on our phones all the time. Well, it's true. What's happened is it's shown that police and us, we're not approachable anymore. The police officer is no longer walking the beat, meeting community members. The police officer is in his or her car with the glow of an onboard laptop lighting up the inside of and that's it. And you just see them drive by. There's no interaction anymore. So I think what needs to be done is that community-based grassroots interaction needs to happen. And I say this from the pro-intelligence collection perspective, right? Is that people are going to talk to you. People are going to tell you what's going on. So I would just add that little bit, that there needs to be this kind of reframing of how policing needs to be done in that sense.
So we could go to one last question, and that is, for recovering addicts, preventing relapse is a daily battle. Were there times where you saw yourself relapsing towards formal, radicalized, and extremist views as you made your way through that loneliness and isolation when you wanted to leave? Tony?
I'd say absolutely, and I think where we see it the most, because it played such a role in my joining, was I would go back to the music. I wouldn't necessarily go back to the social groups, but that was my way of reconnecting to those thoughts, feelings.
So, just to interrupt, they may not know that punk rock was a critical part of your...
Right, there was a whole white power music scene that really developed in the early 80s and has been very strong ever since. They had their own record labels, and I was connected to Resistance Records. And 1984, 1985, when the first single, White Power, by a band called Screwdriver came out. And even though I'd left the movement behind, sometime I'd come home from the bar and get melancholy, and that's where I'd go, as I'd put on those old songs and relive those old moments. And there's times where, I call them phantom thoughts. These thoughts come up that are part of old conditioning, because we were very much conditioned to believe what we were believing. And they pop up, but they're kind of, I know I'm not my thoughts, and they're kind of ethereal. There's not a whole lot of substance to them, but they pop up sometimes like phantom thoughts. And so that happens, and there's always the temptation to go back, but it was so goddamn dysfunctional at every level in that place. And it was the most unhappiest time of my life, that there's no attraction to that anymore.
Angela, last word?
Yeah. I was more afraid leaving prison than I was going in. And I know that sounds strange. Having the very real human experiences that I had that became, the foundation of who I am today, I changed. I knew that I wanted to continue changing, but I grew up constantly hearing racial and homophobic slurs. I would see a person of color and my brain would automatically think a racial slur. And I was horrified at the thought that I was hardwired that way, that I would never be able to undo it. I would never be able to change. I enrolled in community college just a few months after my release. And my fellow students must have thought I was absolutely insane, because I literally had conversations with myself. It took me a few years of stopping myself every time I thought something homophobic, something racist, and really having that conversation with myself. Angela, why did you just think that? Did that person do something? Is this a part of a stereotype you've been taught? And it was like breaking a very difficult habit. And it's something that, to be absolutely honest, when I speak about it today, currently, it will now happen for the next few days. And I think it's, my brain playing tricks on me, but every time I speak about it, it happens. And the best thing that I think we can do about it is, instead of being ashamed, instead of trying to sweep it under the rug, we meet it head on. And we continue to ask ourselves those questions. We continue to be honest about the prejudices that we have, because every one of us has them. It may not be racial, it may not be religious, it could be, I don't like blue M&Ms. But we all have those prejudices, and we just have to be honest about them and continue confronting them.
So thank you for your really great questions, and will you join me in thanking this great group of panelists?